California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are joined by Betty Yee. She's a member of the California Board of Equalization. She's also a candidate for controller of the state. That election will be held in 2014. We thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Brad.
I want to speak with you about the recovery.
Yes.
Or is there a recovery? What's your sense?
Well, my sense is certainly we're seeing signs of recovery, but it is not equally experienced by everyone, and particularly women.
And let's talk about that,
Yes.
because I'm fascinated when we look at the distinctions between men and women. Now, there's one area where we have seen a contraction of jobs.
Yes.
That is government jobs.
Yes.
As a result of state budgets being cut, county budgets being cut, city budgets being cut. Some would argue that's a good thing, but how is that impacting or disproportionately impacting women?
Well, when you look at these public sector jobs, particularly at the state and at the local level, many of them are in our public schools, and many of them are in programs that are where mostly women work. So you look at public school employees, 7 out of 10 public school employees are women. So that's a tremendous number of teachers who have been laid off. About 11% of teachers have lost their jobs since 2011.
And we know that on the federal side, there is the sequester going on.
Yes, yes.
And with regard to the sequester, while you would think that would only impact federal jobs, it doesn't, because the federal government is cutting state funding, county funding,
Exactly.
local funding,
Exactly.
defense funding.
Exactly.
When you think about San Diego as an example, the defense industry is really getting hurt.
Absolutely.
So how is the sequester impacting the economy and women, as you described?
Well, the sequester is slowly taking hold of any gains in recovery, particularly, as you say, to different industry sectors. And for women, again, if these are hitting jobs that are in the public sector, and many of these programs are, particularly in the public assistance area, women are disproportionately affected.
And let's talk about what we call public assistance.
Yes.
Do we have a sense as to, when you compare men and women, who uses the social safety net?
Absolutely, absolutely. So when we talk about here in California, CalWORKs cash assistance, subsidized childcare, and certainly community college opportunities or preschool programs, childcare especially, because these are the work supports for women in order for them to be able to go back to school or to retain a job. Definitely women are disproportionately affected.
And we also know that as a result of the sequester, one specific program has been hit hard, and that's Head Start.
Absolutely.
And Head Start impacts young girls
Yes.
who become women,
Yes.
and also just teachers in the program.
That's right, that's right. So you get it both with respect to who are beneficiaries of the program and who are actually providing the services in the program. And similar with in-home supportive services, where we're trying to keep people safe in their homes, many of the recipients of services are women, but also many of the caregivers are women.
I want to focus as well on women of color.
Yes.
We know that during this recession, individuals of color generally felt the brunt greater than, we'll call it, European descendants.
Right.
Where are we in terms of women of color as we enter the recovery?
Well, prior to the recession, we saw great pay disparity with women of color. So right now, white women are paid 77 cents on every dollar that a man earns.
That's a whole other conversation.
Right? So that's a whole other conversation. But when you look at, frankly, in communities of color, Latinas and African American women fare much more poorly. So African American women earn 70 cents for every dollar that a man earns, and for Latinas, it's about 55 cents on the dollar.
Is it improving? Those numbers? Are the gaps closing?
You know, I think if we can see the doors of opportunities open up more for particularly education opportunities and job opportunities, we can see
and
some.
And we're going to talk about that more when we come back.
Absolutely.
For our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. So, Ms. Yee, let's talk about education, if we may.
Yes.
Because we know over the last 5 years or so, we have seen dramatic cuts at all levels.
Yes.
K-12, K-14, UC, CSU. But with the passage of Prop 30, and with just more money coming into California's coffers, as you know,
Yes.
aside from Prop 30,
Yes.
What is happening on the education front? Are funding levels coming back sufficiently to support all Californians and then the subset, women and women of color?
Absolutely. Certainly this has been, Prop 30 is stabilizing our budget situation, but we're talking about 3-4 years of cuts layered over one another, and so we're going to make some gains, but we're not going to be back and restored to the point of where we were prior to the recession.
And you mentioned community college.
Yes.
And so often community college is that entry point, especially for new immigrants, women of color who may or may not have been newly admitted into the country. How are we doing specifically on the community college side?
Yeah, on the community college side, the enrollment of women in community colleges has dropped significantly since 2007, and we do attribute that to the recession, the fact that women are have less resources in terms of the supports that allow them to be able to go to school.
What about adult education? As you surely know, the governor is proposing really a revolution in adult education.
Yes.
He is looking to shift the responsibility of adult education in K-12. Some people may not realize, but that's where adult education had been from K-12 to community colleges.
Yes.
May feel more intuitive, but be that as it may, where are we on the adult education side?
Well, I think adult education has not seen the funding increases that K-12 has seen over the years, and I do think that certainly there's a greater need now as a result of the recession, but community colleges I think can pick up some of that slack, but it's still, the need is still quite great.
I want to talk about the other end of the age spectrum, and that is our seniors.
Yes.
Men and women,
Yes.
but women, feel free to elaborate on how are women who are seniors faring during this downturn and hopeful recovery?
Well, I think generally, as we see women in their older adult life, they tend to live longer.
Right. That's right.
Tend to be more likely than men to live alone. And many of them live in poverty in their older adult years. And so as we see the recession, we're actually seeing a drag on more women falling into these below lower income levels. And so we do see that the need for public services will become greater.
It's interesting. I go back to the sequester. As you know, recently the federal government, there was a bipartisan bill to reform the way the FAA could spend its funds so we wouldn't have these flight delays that we had as a result of the sequester. Everyone was pleased that we're not going to have flight delays, but some people spoke up and said, wait a second, we fixed the issue with the FAA, but what about the 4 million seniors who are on Meals on Wheels? The seniors who are not getting their Meals on Wheels because of the sequester.
That's right. That's right.
What are you seeing?
Well, what we're seeing is really this is a population that has a less muted political voice, and so what we are seeing is more of a public outcry with respect to what's happening relative to our air flights, and less of a public outcry or a less vocal public outcry with respect to our lower income, more vulnerable members of our society. So it is unfortunate, but I do think that the numbers will become so great that there will have to be some address of this.
Do you believe that? Because look, when you look at what's happening with the sequester, where have they done piecemeal work? They did it with regard to the FAA. They did it with regard to meat industry inspectors. They did it with regard to tuition assistance for military members. Easy. You know, well-heeled interests, popular interests. Meals on Wheels?
I think we're going to see a lot of that voice begin to rise is really at the state and local level, because these are going to be the providers of last resort, the states and the counties, and without the additional resources from the federal government, it's going to become a very untenable situation budgetarily.
So now that you're launching a campaign statewide, you represent a quarter of the state, which is significant, but now that you're launching a statewide campaign, what are your constituents to be saying to you about these issues of equity, about disparities between men and women or people of color?
Absolutely. These inequities are being felt every day, and you can see them all throughout the state. One need not look any further than in Silicon Valley, where you have certainly the high-tech industry continuing to rebound, and at the same time you have a service sector of the economy that is predominantly occupied by lower-wage workers who are not feeling the economic effects of the recovery. And so you see that. We just had a story recently where Sonoma County, same thing. You have a fairly middle-class community, but you also have a heavily rapidly growing Latino population that's not keeping pace.
Okay, her name is Betty Yee. She is a member of the Board of Equalization, running for controller in 2014. I'm Brad Pomerance. You're watching California Edition.
In what state is gender income inequality the greatest? Louisiana, Utah, West Virginia, or Wyoming? According to the Census Bureau, women in Utah have it the worst. There, the average working woman makes 55 cents for every dollar the average working man makes.
It's California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. I'm glad you're with us today. We are joined by Jean Fuller. She's a member of the California State Senate. We thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Fuller. I want to speak with you about prison realignment. As you know, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling a couple of years back that was scathing against the state, arguing that the state was operating its prisons in a cruel and unusual fashion. The governor's response was a realignment plan whereby the state prison system would decrease its population by sending lower-level offenders to county jails. There are always ramifications when you make a change. Talk to us about ramifications, for example, in your part of the state, Kern County.
Well, in my 4 counties, and particularly in Kern County, we have had a really bad time with this. It has not been well planned. The implementation, when it came down, there was not sufficient information about how much money was coming for each person.
And it's interesting you mention that, because I've spoken with many members who represent rural, semi-rural areas like yourself, and the complaint has been that the funding mechanism, which was meted out by CSAC, which is the California Counties Association, has favored the urban counties to the detriment of these semi-urban, suburban, rural counties.
Well, the dollars haven't been aligned with the number of realigned prisoners coming back, for one thing, and of course the size of the facility. You can imagine if you were in your home and somebody said, "Oh, I'm going to send you 150 people to come live with you, and by the way, it'll be tomorrow, and by the way, we don't know how much money we're going to send you," you might have a little difficulty with that policy.
The challenge, though, for the governor, and frankly for the state, is that the court was very firm, very clear at what they wanted. They gave a firm timetable. And as you know, recently a 3-judge panel issued a 71-page ruling that was scathing against the state, indicating that they questioned the governor's good faith. They said there was no convincing evidence that overcrowding was not a problem anymore, and it concluded by saying they exercised exceptional restraint in not holding the governor in contempt for failing to make those targets of decreasing the prison population.
Well, I'm going to say that Governor Schwarzenegger had almost the same case delivered to him, and if you remember, he said basically, if you want to drag me to jail, you can, but you know, we are California, we are doing it our way, and we are working through the implementation.
Now, Jerry Brown may go to jail. I could see him, you know,
yes,
former Catholic
he actually could handle it probably pretty well.
He probably could. But that being said, the punishment could be of not so much the governor going to jail, but a financial penalty, which we can't afford.
Well, I think the issue is that, you know, we had a prison deal a couple of years ago. I think it was AB 900.
Right.
And that was going to sort of help solve the situation, and we never did really implement that. It was all passed. It was a bipartisan deal.
What did AB 900 do?
Remember, it said it would build more medical facilities in prisons, and it had like goals for how to expand some of the county facilities to be like an arm of the state prison.
And you know as well that right before the ruling was just issued that I just mentioned, there was another ruling that talked about the healthcare system in California, which is under receivership as it relates to the prisons.
Well, there was an issue then.
Yes.
I mean, this is an issue that has been moving along, and I think the problem is that the way we in California look at how we allocate our beds is different. You know, I actually have toured my prisons. Tehachapi is one, and a number of years ago, you know, I would have said that it was crowded in certain circumstances, but that we could realign how we did our beds over a period of time, and AB 900 would have taken care of that.
Why don't we do this? When we come back, let's continue the conversation. For our viewers on HLN, thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back with Senator Fuller. So, Senator, there are folks who believe that California has made a good faith effort. And while possibly California has not hit the firm target, we're about 10,000 over from what the court had wanted, we've made progress. So should the governor push for an appeal? Should he seek Supreme Court intervention? Whether they take it's another question.
Well, absolutely. The governor was the attorney general,
yes.
And the governor certainly knows how the whole process works, and he is the best person suited at this time to push back on this and find a way to make our prisons be the kind of places that we want them to be. And I'm not saying we don't need improvement. We had a plan for improvement.
Right.
It's difficult to get a bipartisan plan on prisons because half of us don't don't want to spend a lot of money on prisons, and the other half of us don't want to send anyone there. So it's a little bit difficult for us, but we did, and we just needed to sustain that and finish that out, and then have the pushback we need to get that done.
What I'm also hearing from some folks is they remember that Prop 30, which did pass, did have an element of funding for realignment, a guaranteed funding stream. And so if we have this new funding stream for realignment, why are we still facing these difficulties?
Well, part of the problem is that one size doesn't fit all. And there was a different level of funding in the beginning. There are different sizes. Kern County, for example, had qualified under the first bill to build out their county facilities, and then they would have been uniquely suited to actually take maybe some of the other neighboring areas prisoners as well. But because that money was held up, nobody could decide when to get it, even though it was all passed by the legislature, all sitting on the table there to go. It didn't get implemented, and so then they received all these prisoners, and they haven't been able to build. They're not ready, and it's really not their fault. So now, we need some extra funding to reduce the unanticipated consequences to the system.
You mentioned build out, and it begs the question. In the 80s, even part of the 90s, California was building state prisons. That stopped. And there is this view that we shouldn't spend money on prisons, we should spend money on education. And that may be a wise move. I mean, you were a superintendent yourself.
I totally agree with that statement.
But could it be time that we need to start building prisons?
Let's talk about what this plan did. It did not build state prisons.
It did not.
No, what it did was actually it converted county facilities, which are short-term holding cells, to places where people who have long-term sentences can stay. And that's the difference.
And it was supposed to be that those sentences would not break 3 years. Your colleague, Senator Emerson, for example, had a bill that if a sentence for whatever reason did break 3 years, that the individual should serve. That bill did not proceed. I mean, both Democrats and Republicans have been frustrated because these bills to tinker with realignment are not gaining any traction. There's this big fear of this court decision hanging over the state. But I do want to ask you, though, again, about building prisons. I mean, is it time for California to look at constructing prisons? County jails is another issue. Look, it could help the economy, it's infrastructure. We clearly need more beds.
Well, clearly, I think, because I was with that group that negotiated that first AB 900, that was a very good solution to how to beef up the county jails and how to change the system incrementally over time in order to be able to accommodate both our need to keep people incarcerated and our need to find the lowest cost place to put our prisoners. And our problem now is that we are we haven't implemented that plan. We don't really have a new plan that's working, and we're not passing any laws that actually fix the unanticipated consequences, which always happens, and we always call them cleanup bills, and we always do it.
So now what? I mean, why can't these bills gain some traction? I mean, some of them are bipartisan. For example, Senator Liu, your colleague, a Democrat, has a bill with Assemblyman Patterson dealing with GPS tracking devices. That bill seems to be stalled. I mean, it's not just Republican bills that are dying.
That is correct, and there is growing bipartisan frustration with the realignment and its unanticipated consequences. And so, ultimately, I think we have to publicize it. We have to let the public know that it isn't working and that we want to fix it. But I think there has to be some pressure from the public about these increasing crime statistics. That while no one wants to say it's causation, It's amazing
Could
that
be.
we're letting this many people out, and those crime statistics are growing. And at the bottom of the day, it doesn't matter what the cause is. If crime is
fix it.
becoming a bigger problem for people, then government needs to make them safe.
Her name is Jean Fuller. I'm Brad Pomerance. You are watching California Edition.
What percentage of inmates in California's state prisons suffer from mental illness? 10, 25, 33, or 50%? 1 in 4 prisoners in the California state system battle mental illness.
Welcome back. It's California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. Glad you're with us. Our guest is Rocky Chavez. He is in the freshman class of the California State Assembly. Sir, how's your new job? You had been Secretary of Veterans Affairs in Sacramento, so a bit of a coming home, but new position.
I'm enjoying it so much because it's such a positive attitude now with the new class of 12.
Right.
We call ourselves, we're here to 12 and we'll be here for 12.
Hey, that's right. That's right.
And there's 40 of us.
Right.
So it's an exciting time.
Now, you join at a time when the Republican Party had a tough year in 2012, so you're part of a pretty small minority, I guess you could say. But as I understand it, you're still making moves and trying to get some stuff done. How is that?
You know, the reality is California's in a tough spot, still with jobs. We have some more income than we did before because of Prop 30.
Sure.
But there needs to be thoughtful decisions because, as you know, Prop 30 only lasts for 4 years. So this is an opportunity to make good structural changes to deal with the issues in California.
So do you feel as if those changes can be made? We've talked a lot about the notion of tax reform or really changing the way Sacramento operates. You know, since you can be here 12 years, you'll have time to dig your teeth in. So do you see that possibility being effectuated?
Very much so. And one of my big issues about education. People ask, why did you want to get elected? I wanted to get elected to help make education better in California. So those sorts of issues on K through 12, you know, Common Core,
Right.
looking at how we're local funding issues. There's a lot of substantive changes in how we can make sure our children are prepared for a world economy.
And we'll have to look into that, but I want to speak with you about a bill that has fascinated me. You may not know this, but I am a lawyer. I don't practice anymore. And so when I read this bill, it never even struck me that this would be proposed. I'm not taking a position, but it was stunning. And what the bill would do is it would allow legal immigrants to serve on a jury, make them eligible. They would be called to serve. I mean, they'd be part of the pool. What's your sense of this bill? How did this happen?
At 3 different levels, I think there's a problem.
But before you tell me about the problem, do you know how this bill even percolated?
Well, the first issue is how it came
Yeah,
forward.
please.
As you know, something of this substance, to have no public input, had a little committee hearing on Tuesday within less than 48 hours, voted on in the assembly, and passed out with no input at all. It's just amazing to me because
Right.
it's fundamentally address the issue of a jury of your peers. It talks about a relationship. What's the ability of the United States government to impose upon a citizen, let's say from Russia or China or India? They're here legally, maybe working in the high-tech industry, and we're going to go to them and say, oh, by the way, you have a duty to sit on our courts.
But are these individuals who are legal residents, are they not our peers? That
I
really is the question.
and actually, I think that's the central issue because
Right.
when you deal with a court situation as a lawyer, you know that we have certain things that are like innocent until proven guilty.
Right.
That's not universal to the world.
No.
When you look at the issue of women's rights, women are seen as equals in our culture. That's not seen in every culture. So you're bringing other issues within the courtroom.
But by definition, simply because you go from legal resident to citizen, are you immediately imbued with that notion of American values?
But as you know, when you become a citizen, you're either a citizen because you were born there by descent,
Right.
or you consent. You choose to be a citizen, and when you choose to be a citizen, you take an oath to the country and you accept the responsibility and duties as a citizen. One of those responsibilities is a duty to sit on the court. You know, a lot of people don't know you don't have to vote. No one comes and grabs you.
Some countries require it.
Yeah, but not here.
When we come back, I want to continue this conversation. For our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. So, Mr. Chavez, I'm really glad that you brought this up because the LA Times, as you may have known, recently editorialized against it. So a lot of people are talking about this bill and whether it is appropriate. I presume, as you know or may not know, there's no other state that does this. Is this right? This would be a revolution.
There's no other state that does this, and the two arguments that were presented on it was, one, we don't have enough people serving on the courts. Well, that's not true. 3.4 million Californians last year reported for jury duty. Only 186,000 of them were actually jurors. Because, as you probably have done, you go down to the courthouse at 7:30 to check in by 8. You sit there for 4 or 5 hours, and if they don't call you, then they say you're done, see you next year. Californians are stepping up to the challenge of being jurors. There's no shortage.
So what was the motivation?
That was one of the motivations. They said we needed to have more jurors, which obviously is fallacious. The other argument that came up and says, well, we have military serving. If they can serve in the military without citizens, can't they serve as jurors?
Interesting.
The reality is, having served in the Marine Corps for 28 years, you don't serve on juries if you're in the military. You're exempt. So the idea to try to say, well, they're already serving here in the military, why can't they be in the courts? Military people do not serve on the courts.
Well, at this stage, there are about 2.5 million legal residents.
Right.
Could one argue that by having them eligible for jury service, that it would actually bring them into our society in a greater way, and when they do become citizens, they will be more enfranchised in America?
You assume they want to be brought into our society. That's an assumption. That goes back to the issue of consent. They have an option. They can choose to be a citizen. I know a number of people who've been here for 5, 10, and 20 years who do not choose to be citizens.
Right.
They're just here legally.
So my question is, and I don't know if you know the answer, is this even legal under federal law?
You know, that's the question I asked the maker of the bill, and he was a lawyer.
Right.
He says, you know, Rocky, you bring up a good point. I don't know if we can even legally do this.
Right.
And I think it's actually, at the end of the day, the United States government is imposing a duty upon a non-U.S. citizen from Russia, China, India, to do something that our citizens will.
But it's interesting because it's the California state government, which is an arm of the United States government. And so there's a states' rights issue involved, I would presume. But still, you're dealing with an immigrant, and we know that the Supreme Court has said, you look at what's happened in Arizona and Alabama, that laws dealing with immigration are really in the federal purview. They're not in the state purview.
And that's right, but I think it's also going to go to the emotional purview. When you start talking about people saying, would you like to be judged by the gentleman from Boston who did those atrocities, that was here legally, would you like to be judged with him on your court? He could be, according to this rule.
He could be, but the other gentleman who was a citizen also could be.
That's right.
So, you know, my concern is this notion that that there's a big bright line between legal immigrant and citizen. I'm not necessarily convinced, and I've heard people say this, that by definition, once you get those papers making you a citizen, that somehow you have that cultural experience.
You have the responsibility, though, and that's the issue.
I understand. That's the distinction you're making.
And the two issues are this. There's only two really requirements you as a citizen we can force upon you. One is to serve in a jury, and the other is to be drafted. Should we start drafting non-citizens? When we start going down this path, where does the path end? When people make a decision by consent to become a citizen, then they accept those duties and responsibilities.
I can't wait to see what happens with this bill.
It's
fascinating.
It's going to be fun. It's going to be around for a while.
In our final minute, though, I do want to ask you, you mentioned you are a Marine Colonel. You represent significant portions of San Diego County. That county has been hit very hard by the sequester. I've spoken with your colleague, Tony Atkins. She's very concerned about how San Diego will be impacted by the I'm just going to call them draconian cuts. I'm not taking a position. What's your sense?
You know, I actually think because of the foreign policy shift to the east, we're going to be seeing more Navy shipping coming to San Diego. The Marine Corps, as you know, it is going to take a reduction, which will impact my district up north on Oceanside. But California is in a really good strategic position to hold on the majority of it.
One of the jobs that are being impacted by that decrease.
There's three components to it. One is the active duty forces, the second is your training areas, and the third is the industries and behind it to support it, like, you know, General Atomics.
Right.
So it's a complex issue, but we're going to see California competing maybe with Georgia or South Carolina or North Carolina, where there's other military stations. And how do we make those arguments? We're going to need congressmen and senators to make them.
Well,
to keep them
when
here.
you come back on our program, let's talk more about the sequester.
I'd love to talk about
Okay,
it.
his name is Rocky Chavez. He's a member of the California State Assembly. I'm Brad Pomerance. This is California Edition.